Solitude is usually portrayed as a deficiency, a social failure, or a temporary condition that must be corrected as quickly as possible. Modern culture treats constant connection as proof of health and success, while silence is viewed with suspicion. Arthur Schopenhauer saw this very differently. For him, solitude was not a punishment imposed by society, but the natural condition of a mind that sees too clearly to be satisfied with noise. According to Schopenhauer, the more intelligent a person becomes, the less they are able to tolerate superficial social life, because most interactions are built on illusion, pretense, and mutual self-deception. Silence is not chosen out of arrogance or bitterness, but out of necessity. A deep mind cannot endlessly participate in conversations that avoid truth in favor of comfort. This is why solitude often becomes the fate of those who think independently. Not because they reject people, but because they cannot reject reality. Schopenhauer argued that most human behavior is driven not by reason, but by blind will, an unconscious force pushing people toward pleasure, status, and distraction. Social life is structured around satisfying this will through validation and belonging. For an individual who becomes aware of this mechanism, participation begins to feel artificial. Small talk becomes exhausting. Social rituals feel hollow. The intelligent person slowly realizes that many relationships demand performance rather than presence. Solitude then appears not as loss, but as relief. In silence, the mind no longer has to defend itself against constant stimulation or shallow expectations. It can observe, reflect, and exist without distortion. This is where freedom begins. Not the freedom to do whatever one wants, but the freedom to see clearly, without being pressured to conform. Schopenhauer believed that the price of this clarity is loneliness, because most people are not seeking truth. They are seeking comfort. When someone refuses to participate in collective illusions, they inevitably become isolated. Yet this isolation is not emptiness. It is space. Space where thought can deepen, where identity no longer depends on approval, and where the individual stops living a borrowed life. Solitude, in this sense, is not withdrawal from life, but a confrontation with it in its raw form. Schopenhauer made a strict distinction between solitude and loneliness, a distinction that modern culture often fails to understand. Loneliness is a state of lack, the pain of wanting connection and not receiving it. Solitude, on the other hand, is fullness, the capacity to remain with oneself without fleeing into distraction. Highly intelligent individuals are not immune to loneliness, but they are uniquely capable of transforming it into solitude. This transformation begins when a person realizes that much of what passes for connection is actually transaction. Attention is exchanged for conformity. Presence is exchanged for agreement. Belonging is conditional on playing a role. For a mind that values truth over comfort, these conditions feel like a subtle form of imprisonment. Over time, the intelligent person notices an inner tension. To remain socially accepted, they must soften their thoughts, dilute their perceptions, and silence inconvenient questions. This creates an internal fracture. One part of the self adapts outwardly, while another retreats inwardly, becoming increasingly isolated even in company. Solitude resolves this fracture. When one withdraws consciously, the need to perform disappears. Thought no longer has to ask permission. Feelings no longer need to be edited. Silence becomes a sanctuary where inner life can unfold without compromise. Schopenhauer believed that this is why solitude often brings both peace and pain. Peace because the mind is no longer distorted by constant social pressure. Pain because clarity strips away comforting illusions. In solitude, one sees how much of social life is driven by fear, envy, and unconscious competition. This awareness makes return difficult. Once a person experiences the calm of not having to pretend, superficial interactions become intolerable. This is the true cost of intelligence, not arrogance, but alienation. The world does not reject the thinker. The thinker simply no longer fits comfortably into a world built on distraction. Solitude then becomes an act of self-preservation, a way to remain whole rather than divided. It is not an escape from others, but a refusal to abandon oneself. As solitude deepens, something unsettling begins to happen. The structures that once gave life meaning start to weaken. Goals that were pursued for years suddenly feel empty. Social rewards lose their emotional pull. Praise feels hollow, and criticism loses its sting. Schopenhauer described this phase as a quiet dismantling of illusion. It is not dramatic, and it does not arrive with clear explanations. It feels more like a slow fading of interest in what once mattered. Many people mistake this stage for depression or failure, but in reality, it is a reorientation of consciousness. The mind is no longer satisfied with borrowed meaning. It demands coherence, depth, and inner truth. This demand creates discomfort because society is organized around external validation. Status, productivity, and approval function as psychological substitutes for purpose. When an individual steps away from these substitutes, a vacuum appears. Silence becomes louder. Time feels heavier. Thoughts gain intensity. This is the point where most people turn back. They reattach themselves to noise, relationships, and routines, not because they are fulfilling, but because they are familiar. The intelligent mind faces a harder choice. To move forward, it must tolerate uncertainty without anesthetic. Schopenhauer believed this tolerance was rare because it requires strength without reward. There is no applause for clarity, no social recognition for refusing illusions. Yet this is precisely where freedom begins. In this inner emptiness, the individual encounters the self without decoration. Fears surface, desires are exposed, contradictions become visible. This encounter is uncomfortable because it removes excuses. One can no longer blame society, upbringing, or circumstances alone. Responsibility shifts inward. The individual realizes that many attachments were never chosen consciously. They were inherited, absorbed, or accepted to avoid discomfort. Solitude forces a reckoning with this fact. It asks a simple but devastating question: who are you when no one is watching? For Schopenhauer, this question marked the threshold between a life lived mechanically and a life lived deliberately. Those who endure this phase emerge changed. They do not become happier in a conventional sense, but they become anchored. Their identity is no longer negotiated moment by moment through external reactions. It is grounded internally. This grounding reduces dependency on others without eliminating empathy. The thinker does not withdraw out of contempt, but out of necessity, to protect coherence in a world that rewards fragmentation. With this internal grounding comes a shift in how relationships are experienced. Schopenhauer observed that as awareness grows, the individual becomes increasingly sensitive to the hidden mechanics of social life. Conversations reveal themselves as performances. Affection often carries conditions. Agreement is rewarded more than honesty. What once felt natural now feels rehearsed. This does not mean others are malicious. It means most people are unconsciously negotiating safety, status, and belonging. For the individuated mind, this constant negotiation becomes exhausting. Silence begins to feel cleaner than dialogue, not because words are useless, but because they are so often used to conceal rather than reveal. At this stage, solitude is no longer only a refuge. It becomes a filter. Only what is essential remains tolerable. Schopenhauer believed this narrowing was misunderstood as coldness or arrogance, when in fact it was an act of self-preservation. The mind that has tasted clarity cannot easily return to comfortable falsehoods. This creates friction. Friends may feel abandoned. Family may feel rejected. Society interprets withdrawal as hostility. Yet the withdrawal is not against people, but against roles that require self-betrayal. The individual begins to choose depth over frequency, truth over harmony, coherence over popularity. This choice carries a cost. Social circles shrink. Shared language disappears. Humor stops landing. Values diverge. The thinker stands increasingly alone, not because they despise others, but because alignment becomes rare. Schopenhauer argued that this loneliness is not a tragedy, but a consequence of seeing too clearly. When illusions fall, companionship based on illusion cannot survive. What replaces it is not emptiness, but a quieter form of richness. Time stretches. Observation sharpens. Inner dialogue becomes more honest. The individual learns to sit with themselves without distraction. This capacity is crucial, because without it, freedom collapses back into dependency. Solitude teaches emotional self-sufficiency, not the denial of connection, but the refusal to need connection to justify existence. At this stage, as this equilibrium stabilizes, a deeper realization emerges. Freedom is not the accumulation of options, but the reduction of inner compulsion. Schopenhauer warned that most people mistake constant movement for vitality, when in reality, it is often avoidance. They seek noise to escape themselves, relationships to mute inner emptiness, and ambition to outrun dissatisfaction. The individuated person begins to see this pattern everywhere. Work becomes a distraction. Entertainment becomes sedation. Social life becomes anesthesia. This insight is unsettling because it reveals that much of what society calls happiness is merely organized distraction. Once this is seen, participation becomes difficult. The individual can still function, still work, still interact, but no longer with the same illusion. They are present, but not absorbed, engaged, but not possessed. This distance is often interpreted as detachment or lack of passion, yet it is the opposite. It is a refusal to waste emotional energy on illusions that no longer convince. Schopenhauer believed that this stage marks the transition from being driven by the will to observing it. Desire loses its tyranny, ambition softens, comparison fades. What replaces them is a sober clarity that feels almost empty at first. Many mistake this emptiness for depression, but it is not collapse. It is silence after noise. The nervous system recalibrates. Old cravings lose their charge. New desires do not rush in to replace them. This is the most dangerous moment in the process because it tempts regression. The world will offer familiar comforts. Validation will return if one performs again. Belonging will be restored if one accepts the old script. Many return here, not because they are weak, but because clarity is lonely. To continue requires patience and courage. Slowly, something else grows in the quiet. A subtler satisfaction. A sense of inner sufficiency. Creativity returns, not as a need to impress, but as expression. Thought deepens, not to dominate others, but to understand existence itself. Life becomes smaller on the surface, but denser beneath. Schopenhauer saw this as the closest form of freedom available to humans. Not joy in the conventional sense, but relief. Relief from compulsion, from performance, from endless striving. The individual no longer expects life to entertain them. They learn to inhabit it. This is not a happy ending, it is a truthful one. At the final stage of this process, solitude is no longer experienced as absence, but as presence. The individual who has passed through illusion, alienation, and inner confrontation no longer seeks confirmation from the external world. Schopenhauer argued that at this point, a person ceases to demand that life justify itself. Expectations dissolve. Hope, in its naive form, fades. What remains is a calm attentiveness to reality as it is, not as it should be. This is where many misunderstand the philosopher, assuming pessimism where there is actually precision. Schopenhauer did not advocate despair, but lucidity. He believed that suffering multiplies when we resist the structure of existence and diminishes when we stop bargaining with it. In solitude, the individual learns to observe the will without being consumed by it. Desire still arises, but it no longer commands obedience. Pain still appears, but it no longer defines identity. This does not make one invulnerable. It makes one less reactive. Social life can now be entered without self-betrayal. Relationships are no longer used to fill emptiness, but shared when they naturally align. Approval loses its magnetic pull. Rejection loses its sting. The individual becomes harder to manipulate, not through cynicism, but through self-containment. This is why true independence is rare. It cannot be granted. It must be endured. Society rewards adaptation, not individuation. It celebrates productivity, not clarity. Those who reach this stage often remain invisible because they no longer perform their inner life publicly. They speak less, but with precision. They act less, but with intention. Schopenhauer believed that wisdom is not accumulation, but subtraction. Removing illusions, removing false hopes, removing the need to be seen. What remains is not greatness, but coherence. A person aligned with themselves, no longer fragmented by competing desires or borrowed identities. This is the quiet freedom that few seek and even fewer sustain. It offers no applause, no guarantee of happiness, only the relief of no longer being at war with one's own mind. In a world built on noise, this silence appears empty. In truth, it is full. In the final understanding, solitude is revealed not as an escape from life, but as a return to it without distortion. What has been lost along the way is not society itself, but the compulsion to be defined by it. Schopenhauer believed that most human suffering comes from the constant friction between inner reality and outer expectation. When this friction is removed, not by withdrawal, but by clarity, the mind settles into a state that no longer demands continuous stimulation or reassurance. This is not indifference. It is alignment. The individual now understands that meaning is not something granted by recognition, success, or belonging. Meaning emerges when perception is no longer fragmented by the need to perform. At this stage, solitude stops feeling like resistance and becomes neutrality. One can move through crowds without feeling absorbed by them. One can engage in conversation without losing oneself in approval or conflict. The world continues unchanged, but the internal relationship to it is transformed. Schopenhauer described this as a form of quiet emancipation from the tyranny of the will. Not the destruction of desire, but its demotion. Desire no longer governs action by default. Choice becomes possible. This is why such freedom is unsettling to others. A person who does not need validation cannot be easily directed. A person who does not fear isolation cannot be easily coerced. This independence is often mistaken for coldness or arrogance, yet it is neither. It is simply a refusal to trade inner coherence for social comfort. The price of this state is permanent. There is no full return to earlier innocence. Once illusions dissolve, they cannot be sincerely rebuilt. Many sense this and turn back before the process completes. They choose familiarity over truth, noise over silence, belonging over freedom. Schopenhauer never promised happiness at the end of this path. He promised honesty, a life no longer inflated by false hopes, but also no longer crushed by false fears. The individual who reaches this point lives more lightly. They expect less, but perceive more. They are less impressed, but more attentive. Solitude is no longer something they enter. It is something they carry with them, a stable inner space that remains intact regardless of circumstance. This is not the life of the admired, nor the life of the celebrated. It is the life of the unentangled. In a culture that equates visibility with value, this choice appears almost invisible. Yet it is precisely here, in this quiet refusal to perform, that the deepest form of freedom quietly endures.